Welcome to another deep dive. Today's topic, you gave me a whole bunch of research about hypercompetition.
Yeah.
And it seems like we're trying to figure out if this is just like a trendy business buzzword or if it's like the actual reality of how business works today.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely been a hot topic for a while, and there's a lot of debate about if it's really, you know, the new normal or if it even exists at all.
Oh, so right off the bat, we've got some controversy. This is going to be good.
Yeah. Is that
Before we go any further, let's make sure we're all on the same page.
okay?
When we say hypercompetition, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah. So from the research you gave me, it seems like there isn't one single definition that everyone agrees on,
Okay.
and that's part of the problem. But one of the big things that most of the research talks about is this idea of like temporary competitive advantage.
Okay.
So it's not like the old days where you could build up like a fortress and just defend it.
I see.
Things are changing so fast.
Yeah. So are you saying that companies can't just like rest on what they've already done? They had to like constantly be attacking and trying to like outmaneuver the competition?
Exactly. Like, imagine a game of chess where like the rules are always changing, the board's getting bigger, and there's new pieces popping up all the time.
Okay.
You have to be really agile and adaptable and ready to make bold moves. And this is kind of where the idea of like an action-based strategy comes in.
Action-based strategy.
Yeah, forget about those long drawn-out plans.
Right.
In a hyper-competitive market, you have to be able to see an opportunity to analyze it and act like that.
So it's all about speed, basically.
Yeah, speed and adaptability are key.
Okay, so why is the business world so much more intense these days than it used to be?
Well, there are a few factors at play.
Like what?
Well, globalization, for one, has made competition way more intense.
Right.
Markets are connected all over the world now.
So the world's a smaller place and there's more people to compete with.
Exactly. And then on top of that, technology is changing faster than ever before.
Yeah.
Just think about how the internet has like completely reshaped entire industries like music and retail.
Yeah, that's true. It's like everything's changing all the time.
Yeah, the ground is constantly shifting under our feet.
Yeah. And let's not forget about customers.
Oh yeah, they're more demanding than ever.
They've got so many choices, so much information at their fingertips.
Exactly. Their expectations are sky high.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
Absolutely. And then you've got things like new regulations, economic shifts, and even demographic trends.
Right.
All of these things can like completely change the game for an entire industry like that.
Yeah. It sounds like businesses today are facing like a perfect storm of competitive pressure.
I think that's a good way to put it.
So let's get to the heart of it. What are the consequences of all this? What happens if hypercompetition really is the new normal?
Well, for one thing, it makes it a lot harder to be successful in the long run.
What do you mean?
Like, some of the research you gave me actually shows that profits are becoming more volatile in certain industries. Market share is constantly changing hands,
Yeah.
and the risk of a company failing goes way up.
Okay. Well, that's kind of scary.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging environment.
So if you're a business leader listening to this, you're probably thinking, how do I survive? How do I thrive in this crazy world?
Right. That's the million-dollar question.
So what does the research say about that?
Well, we'll definitely dig into that more later.
Okay.
But I can tell you that sticking with the traditional ways of doing things might not be enough. Businesses need to develop some new capabilities to stay ahead.
Okay.
One thing that keeps popping up in the research is this idea of dynamic capabilities.
Dynamic capabilities. Okay, what is that? I've never heard of that before.
I know it sounds a little bit fuzzy, but it's actually a really important concept.
Okay.
So basically, dynamic capabilities are like your company's ability to sense changes in the market and then reconfigure its resources to seize opportunities.
I see. Kind of like reinvent yourself to stay ahead of the game.
So it's not enough to just have a great product or a solid plan. You have to be able to adapt as the world changes.
Exactly. It's about being able to transform yourself when you need to.
Kind of like a chameleon.
Yeah, like a chameleon or a shapeshifter.
Okay, I like that image, the shape-shifting company. So in a hyper-competitive world, the ability to transform yourself might be the key to survival.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into this idea of dynamic capabilities and how you can actually build them in your organization.
Sounds good.
All right, so before we went to a break, we were talking all about this concept of hyper-competition and how it's really shaking things up in the business world.
Definitely.
But before we get too deep into strategies and how to deal with it, I think we need to address the big question.
Yeah, what's that?
Does this even exist? Is hypercompetition a real thing, or is it just like a buzzword? That's a great question. And most things in business, the answer isn't so simple.
Right.
You've given me a ton of research on this, and some of it points to, yeah, competition is getting much more intense in some industries.
Okay, so there's some evidence to support it.
There is, for example, one study that looked at the U.S. manufacturing sector and found that profits have become way more volatile over the past few decades,
Okay.
which could mean that competitive advantages just don't last as long as they used to.
So that's a point for team hypercompetition.
Yeah, but on the other hand, there's other research that shows the opposite.
Really?
Yeah, another study also focusing on U.S. manufacturing didn't find any evidence of increasing market instability or decreasing profitability over a similar time period.
So the data is kind of all over the place.
Yeah, it's not giving us a clear yes or no answer.
Okay, well, that's not super helpful for our listener who's trying to make sense of all this.
Right.
What's causing all this conflicting information?
Well, part of the problem is that there's no one definition of hypercompetition that everyone agrees on. So different researchers might be looking at different time periods, different industries, or even using different ways to measure competition.
Right, so what one person considers hypercompetition, another person might just see as business as usual.
Exactly.
So maybe the real question isn't, does hypercompetition exist?
Yeah.
But more like, how is competition changing? And what does that mean for me and my business?
I think that's a much better way to frame it.
Right, because at the end of the day, our listeners trying to figure out how to succeed in the real world,
Right.
regardless of what we call it.
Exactly. So let's shift gears for a second and move away from the academic debate and focus on the practical implications of all this.
Okay.
The reality is that in a lot of industries, things are changing faster than ever.
Yeah.
Technology is accelerating everything, customers are more demanding, and markets are way more dynamic.
Right, it's a whole new ballgame.
It is, and whether we call it hypercompetition or something else, these trends are creating a business environment where the old ways of doing things just might not cut it anymore.
Okay, so let's talk about what businesses can do to thrive in this environment.
Okay.
You mentioned dynamic capabilities earlier
Hmm?
and said it was like a company's shape-shifting superpower.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean?
Sure. So think of it this way. In the past, companies could succeed by building a strong competitive advantage, like a superior product or a really well-known brand.
Right.
And then they could kind of just defend that advantage for as long as possible.
Yeah, makes sense.
But in today's world, things move so fast that any advantage you have is probably going to be temporary.
Oh, that's a little disheartening.
Yeah, it can be tough, but it doesn't mean you should just give up on trying to build a sustainable advantage.
Okay.
It just means that instead of clinging to one advantage for dear life, you need to be constantly creating new ones, even if they're temporary.
So you need to be able to adapt quickly.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do you do that?
Well, you need to be able to sense changes in the market, quickly analyze what they mean, and then reconfigure your resources to adapt and respond. And that's what dynamic capabilities are all about.
Okay, so can you give us an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure. Think about the rise of smartphones.
Okay.
Companies like Nokia, which were like the kings of the mobile phone market at the time.
Right, totally.
They were super slow to adapt to this new technology.
Yeah, I remember that.
They stuck with their traditional phones and their old operating systems for way too long.
They thought it was just a fad, huh?
Yeah, they were so focused on protecting their existing advantage that they missed the boat on the next big thing.
Yeah, and we all know how that story ended.
Right. Apple came along with the iPhone and completely disrupted the market.
And Nokia's market share basically vanished overnight.
Pretty much.
So what's the lesson here?
The lesson is that it's not enough to be successful in the past. You need to be constantly evolving to stay ahead of the curve.
And that's where these dynamic capabilities come in.
Exactly. They allow you to be proactive, not reactive.
I see.
They help you anticipate change and seize those opportunities before your competitors do.
So you become the disruptor, not the disrupted.
Right.
Okay, so how can a company actually build these dynamic capabilities? It sounds like more than just having a flexible business plan.
Yeah, for sure. It requires a real shift in mindset and culture.
Okay.
It's about creating a company that's agile, adaptable, and constantly learning. It's about empowering your employees to experiment, to take risks, and to learn from their mistakes.
So it's less about having a rigid plan and more about having the right people and processes in place to deal with a world that's constantly changing.
Exactly. It's about being comfortable with uncertainty and seeing change as an opportunity, not a threat.
Okay, I like that.
It's like building a company that's like a jazz band.
A jazz band.
Yeah, where everyone's improvising and riffing off of each other, creating something new and exciting in the moment.
That's a great analogy. I love that. But even the best jazz band needs some kind of structure, right?
Of course.
Are there any specific things that companies can do to foster this kind of dynamic environment?
Absolutely. There are tons of concrete steps companies can take.
Like what?
Well, one is to invest in data analytics. Being able to collect and interpret data quickly is essential for understanding what's happening in the market and what your customers are doing,
Data is king.
pretty much. And then another key is to create cross-functional teams.
What does that mean?
So instead of having marketing, product development, and sales all operating in their own little silos, you bring them together into teams that can work quickly and efficiently.
So they're all on the same page?
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, you need to foster a culture of continuous learning and experimentation.
Okay.
You need to encourage your employees to be curious, to ask questions, to challenge the way things are done, and to try new things even if they fail.
So create a safe space for trying new things and taking risks.
Exactly, because in a hyper-competitive world, the companies that are willing to embrace change and disruption are the ones that are going to come out on top.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense, but before we get too carried away with all this talk about agility and disruption, I want to take a step back for a second and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What are the potential consequences of all this hypercompetition for the economy as a whole?
That's a great question.
Could all this intensity actually be a bad thing?
Well, there are definitely some potential downsides to consider.
Like what?
One concern is that hypercompetition could lead to a really short-term focus,
Okay.
where companies are so busy fighting for survival and trying to beat each other
Right.
that they don't invest in things that are important for the long term, like research and development, employee training, or sustainability initiatives.
So it's kind of like a trade-off between short-term gains and long-term sustainability.
Exactly.
Are there any other risks we should be thinking about?
Yeah, another concern is that hypercompetition could lead to increased inequality.
How so?
Well, in a winner-takes-all environment, the companies that can adapt the fastest are going to get most of the profits,
Right.
while the ones that fall behind might struggle to survive.
So it could create a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, that's a possibility. And we also have to think about the impact on workers.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about that. What happens to employees in a hyper-competitive world?
Well, in a fast-paced, high-pressure environment, they might experience more stress burnout and job insecurity.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And some companies might cut corners on things like wages and benefits in order to stay competitive.
So it's not all sunshine and roses.
Definitely not. But it's important to remember that hypercompetition can also be a powerful driver of innovation and economic growth.
Okay, so there's a flip side to this too.
There is. When companies are constantly under pressure to innovate and improve, they're more likely to invest in research and development, come up with new products and services, and find ways to do things more efficiently.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all. Hypercompetition is a complex phenomenon with both positive and negative consequences.
It's a double-edged sword.
Exactly. And it's important to be aware of both sides of the coin.
So we've talked about the potential downsides of hypercompetition, but let's go back to the positives for a second. You mentioned that it can drive innovation. Can you give us some real-world examples of how that works?
Sure, just look at the tech industry over the past few decades.
Okay.
The intense competition in that space has led to an explosion of new and amazing products.
Yeah.
Smartphones, laptops, social media platforms, streaming services, you name it.
And consumers have benefited from all of that.
Absolutely. They've got more choices, better quality, and lower prices.
So even though it can be challenging, hypercompetition can also push companies to do their best and create things that make our lives better.
That's right. Another benefit is that it can force companies to become more efficient and customer-focused.
How so?
Well, when you've got rivals breathing down your neck, you can't afford to be complacent or take your customers for granted.
Right, you have to step up your game.
Exactly. You have to constantly find ways to deliver more value, offer better service, and improve your products or services to stay ahead of the competition.
So in a way, hypercompetition is like a quality control mechanism for the market.
Yeah, you could say that, but it's important to remember that there's no guarantee that the good will outweigh the bad.
Right.
The impact of hypercompetition is going to depend on a lot of factors, including government policies, the actions of individual companies, and the choices that we make as consumers.
It's complicated.
It is, but I think the main takeaway here is that understanding these dynamics is essential for anyone who wants to navigate the modern business world.
Yeah, whether you're a CEO, an entrepreneur, or just someone trying to keep up with the times.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if there's still debate about what exactly hypercompetition is, the trends that it describes are real, and they're happening right now.
So businesses need to be prepared for a world where things change quickly advantages are fleeting and rivals are constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
Exactly. It's a challenging environment, but it's also full of opportunities.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay.
If hypercompetition really is the new normal,
Yeah.
what does that mean for the long-term health of our economy?
That's a really interesting question, and honestly one that I don't have a clear answer to.
Yeah.
It's something that researchers are still trying to figure out.
Right.
There's a lot of debate about whether this level of intensity and disruption is sustainable or if it'll eventually lead to burnout and decline.
So it's like a big experiment that we're all living through.
Kinda, yeah.
Well, it's a pretty thought-provoking note to end on, I think.
I agree.
So to our listener out there, keep your eyes open,
Yeah.
stay agile, and be ready to adapt. The business world is changing faster than ever, and only the most adaptable will survive.
And don't forget to have fun along the way.
Yeah, that's important too.
Ugh.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of hypercompetition. All right, so we're back, and I feel like we spent a lot of time talking about this idea of hypercompetition.
Yeah,
You know, the pros, the cons, all that stuff.
definitely.
But I think our listeners are probably wondering, like, okay, but what does this actually mean for me?
Right.
You know, what can I do about it?
Yeah, exact. How do I actually apply this to my business?
So let's get practical.
Yeah.
If you're a business leader and you're facing this kind of intense competition, what are some strategies that can actually help you win?
Okay, so it's time to move from theory to action.
Zach, give us the playbook.
All right, so first things first, you need to really understand your competition.
Okay.
And I mean like really deeply understand them.
So more than just knowing who they are, what they sell.
Way more, you need to know their strategies,
Okay.
their strengths, their weaknesses, what they're likely to do next.
So it's like a game of chess. You got to be thinking a few moves ahead.
Exactly. You need to anticipate their responses to your actions and have some counter moves ready to go.
So how do you do that in a world where everything's changing so fast?
Well, data is your best friend here.
Okay.
Investing in good data analytics can help you track market trends, see what your competitors are up to, and even anticipate changes in customer behavior.
So you can use data to get a clearer picture of what's happening out there.
Yeah, exactly.
But data alone isn't enough, right?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
You also need the right people and the right structure to make sense of all that data.
Right.
And this is where those dynamic capabilities come in.
Yes, the shape-shifting superpowers.
Exactly. Remember we talked about sensing, seizing, and reconfiguring?
Right.
So how do you actually build those capabilities in your company?
Yeah, that's the question.
Well, one key is to create a culture of collaboration.
Okay.
Get rid of those silos between departments.
So no more marketing versus product development versus sales.
Exactly. You need everyone working together towards the same goal.
So build teams that can move quickly and make decisions efficiently.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to give your employees some autonomy.
What do you mean?
Empower them to experiment, to take risks, and yeah, to fail sometimes.
So create a safe space for trying new things.
Exactly. Because in this kind of environment, learning and adapting quickly is way more important than sticking to a rigid plan.
So it's all about being flexible.
Right.
Okay, so can you give our listeners some specific things they can start doing right now to build a more dynamic company?
Sure. So first start by creating a culture of continuous learning.
Okay, how do you do that?
Encourage your employees to go to industry events.
Okay.
Read articles and books, share their knowledge with each other.
Basically, never stop learning.
Exactly. And then second, encourage experimentation. Set up a system where you can test new ideas quickly and without breaking the bank.
So whether it's a new marketing campaign, a product feature, or just a way to improve a process.
Exactly. Make it safe to try new things.
Okay, I like that. What else?
And third, embrace data-driven decision-making.
Okay.
Get the tools and the people you need to really understand your data.
So you can use that data to make better decisions.
Exactly.
So learn constantly, experiment fearlessly, and let data be your guide.
I think that's a great way to sum it up.
That sounds like a solid action plan.
It is, but there's one more thing I want to add.
Okay, what's that?
Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Sometimes the old rules just don't apply anymore.
Right.
And to stay ahead, you need to be willing to rewrite the rules of the game.
Can you give us an example of a company that's done that successfully?
Sure. Think about Netflix.
Okay.
They totally disrupted the entertainment industry.
Right.
By moving away from traditional TV and embracing streaming.
Yeah. They basically invented a whole new way to watch movies and shows.
They did, and now look at them. They're one of the biggest companies in the world.
It's pretty amazing.
It is, and it shows that you don't have to play by the old rules.
So be bold, be innovative, and don't be afraid to shake things up.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a great message to leave our listeners with.
I agree.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of hypercompetition.
It's been fun.
It has. And remember, the future belongs to those who are willing to adapt, learn, and evolve.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for listening, everyone.